The Impossible State. Islam, Politics, and Modernity's Moral Predicament. Wael B. Hallaq. 7. The central domain of the moral. Love thy neighbor as thyself is the very soul of the moral point of view, which demands that we regard another's good as having the same direct claim on our attention as our own good expectably does. And those wedded to an instrumentalist approach will naturally refuse to attach any rational sense to the idea, holding that our allegiance to morality has to be grounded in the pursuit of our own interests, and finding themselves therefore unable to explain why our moral attention should extend to strangers and to the weak, as it obviously must if another's good weighs with us independently of our own. Yet though I have quoted scripture to bring home the import of a non-instrumentalist conception of morality, can one really maintain that it makes sense only within a religious worldview? Do we not judge the worth of a religion by moral principles we know in our heart of hearts to be right, including the very one in question? Larmore, The Autonomy of Morality. Modern Islamist discourses assume the modern state to be a neutral tool of governance, one that can be harnessed to perform certain functions according to the choices and dictates of its leaders. When not used for oppression, the machinery of state governance can be turned by leaders into a representative of the people's will, determining thereby what the state will become. A liberal democracy, a socialist regime, or an Islamic state implementing the values and ideals enshrined in the Quran and those that the Prophet had once realized in his mini-state of Medina. The modern state is then seen by them just as logic was seen by Aristotle and the Aristotelians. Namely, as a neutral technique or instrument guiding correct thinking about any issue or problem in the world. Until, that is, it was shown centuries after Aristotle, by Muslim intellectuals themselves, that Aristotelian formal logic and the theory of universals on which it rests was inherently saturated with particular metaphysical assumptions that predetermined the nature of its premises and, therefore, its conclusions. The very use of this logic meant an a priori acceptance of a certain brand of metaphysics, one that most Muslim intellectuals rejected. The modern state is no different, for it comes with its own arsenal of metaphysics and much else. It inherently produces certain distinctive effects that are political, social, economic, cultural, epistemic, and, no less, psychological. Which is to say that the state fashions particular knowledge systems that in turn determine and shape the landscape of individual and collective subjectivity and thus much of the meaning of its subjects' lives. As no idea or thought can come into existence outside of a human context, and as no event or act can be conceivable outside time or space, the state, as both abstract thought and concrete practice, is product of a unique historical experience. As a paradigm of governance, it evolved in Europe and was later nurtured by Euro-America, and it subsequently was exported to the colonies and the rest of the world. As we have seen, the modern state is uncomfortably seated in many parts of the world, suffering from lack of legitimacy and unable to rule hitherto homogenized subject populations. We often characterize these as weak or rogue states. Euphemisms for the fact that a non-indigenous form of political control has, relatively recently and without preparation, been violently imposed on colonized societies that never knew or had never on their own or willingly adopted such a form. This perhaps is the most evinctive evidence of the foreignness of the modern state, an entity that is, historically, substantively, and conceptually, thoroughly Euro-American. However, none of this should mean that the modern state is an immutable phenomenon, that it does not and cannot change, that it has not adapted or could not adjust to an ever-changing world. For it is hardly deniable that the state of the 19th century had noticeably evolved by the middle of the 20th. And today's state, as we saw in the preceding chapter, continues to undergo certain changes in response to, inter alia, the emerging challenges of globalization. Yet none of these changes and none of the otherwise persistent structures of the modern state have ever proven themselves compatible with even the basic requirements of Islamic governance. In fact, instead of rendering the modern state less objectionable, The mutations of the last 3 decades, especially in the direction of so-called globalization, have increased their incompatibility progressively. It should not by now come as a surprise that this incompatibility is ultimately a moral one. 1. The major incompatibilities. Let us, by way of summary, count some of the important ways in which this incompatibility manifests itself, while realizing that no single one is mutually exclusive of the others. First, as an anthropocentric entity, the state possesses a metaphysic that resides within its own boundaries as sovereign will. The metaphysic generates its own meanings, which is to say that its particular views of the world are of its own creation and bound by its own standards, however changeable these standards may be. As the highest manifestation of positivism, the state possesses and displays a metaphysic of the here and now, reflecting its own concepts, structures, and practices. What is for the state is its truth of will, its will to power, all other truths being marginal and subordinate. By stark contrast, no form of Islamic governance can permit positivism, nor is there a place for a metaphysic that issues therefrom. If the autonomy of the moral is the highest of all desiderata, then metaphysics, which foregrounds moral autonomy, cannot descend to positivism. If moral autonomy must lead, if it must be the determinant of all determinants, then metaphysics must necessarily transcend the narrow domain of positivist anthropocentricism. The two metaphysics, therefore, stand in an irreconcilable deadlock. Second, and flowing from the former consideration, Islamic governance cannot permit any sovereignty or sovereign will other than that of God. If morality is to guide human actions, if it be autonomous, then it must rest on universal and eternal principles of truth and justice, principles that transcend the manipulation and whims of a positivist entity. It must determine the limits of human actions, drawing a line of separation between what can and cannot be done and curbing the domain of the rational when this leads to the violation of its own domain. In Islamic governance, where, as we have seen, the rule of law takes on one of its most supreme expressions, no earthly sovereignty is allowed to compromise the dictates of moral autonomy. If transcendent morality imposes on us the protection of the poor and the weak, if it creates for them an inherently natural right against the wealth of the rich, then no economic development or capitalist principle can be allowed to override this will. If this morality dictates a humane treatment of others, then no political or scientific calculation whatsoever can be permitted to reduce another's humanity by any measure. To let her starve or send him to the gas chambers, simply in the name of science and rationality. As Paul Kahn aptly observed, there are no principles of restraint on the use of force in a polity that understands itself as the expression of popular sovereignty under the rule of law. On the other hand, a state that understands itself as an expression of a divine or a natural order can look to meanings outside of itself to limit its actions. Islamic governance is thus bound by a sovereign will outside of and higher than itself, whereas the modern state's sovereignty represents an inner dialectic of self-constitution. Sovereignty constitutes the state and is constituted by it. These two opposed conceptions of sovereignty will inevitably stand in a deadlock. Third, and flowing from the former two considerations, if God is the only sovereign, which is to say, if God is the ultimate source of moral authority, then any system that regulates human behavior must heed the general norms and technical rules and regulations derived from and dictated by the higher moral principles. This, for Muslims past and present, is the true and ultimate meaning of the rule of law. As we saw in Chapter 3, the best form of separation of powers in the paradigmatic modern state suffers from defects that render the system, even as an elaborate theory, inconsistent, confused, and even a failure. If the modern state as a sovereign will inherently bestows on the executive branch powers formidable enough to chip away at the legislative, then the rule of law would have to be defined in terms of executive will as much as of that of legislative will. At the same time, judicial review chips away at the latter will still further, reducing its purview and narrowing its competence. Such a constitutional arrangement, integral to the structures of the modern state, would be unthinkable in any form of Islamic governance, making the two arrangements, both in theory and in practice, largely incompatible. Fourth, and reflecting the aggregate effects of the former three considerations. The modern state produces subjects that differ from those produced by any form of Islamic governance in profoundly political, social, moral, epistemic, and psychological ways. The microcosmic insistence of the Muslim subject on the unity of the is and ought is a faithful representation of the macrocosmic shari and Yufist insistence that fact and value are one and the same. That all existence is a unity, and that the term poor in Quranic discourse and in Muslim social and economic life is not a statistic or a scientific datum. In the very terms poor and poverty, the value of an inherent right to aid, assistance, and compassion is intertwined with and indistinguishably meshed into the fact of descending into poverty. There is no poor in the vocabulary and conceptual categories of Islamic governance that can be distinguished in any way from the deontological moral value not only of the poor's right to aid but also of a commensurate duty incumbent upon those who can provide it. This type of non-distinction is pervasive, extending to nature and the nature of things. Everything in the world is the work of one agent who created one and all for a reason. No atom of a good or bad deed can be separated from any atom of sand or seed. Everything is interconnected, and all things are but one. Living in the world is living in the kingdom of God, with all of its fortunes and misfortunes, its good and evildoers, its trees and rivers, its poor and rich. To live in this world is to accept the majestic wisdom of its Creator, as manifested in His creation. It is to accept humanity with its honorable strengths and dishonorable weaknesses. But it is also to accept the necessity and the paradigmatic desideratum of striving to be good and of being thankful for being alive and for the bounties bestowed upon humankind, however small or large they may be. It is to surrender to the majesty of this creation, our transient abode and our test of goodness. There is no reason for humankind to exist other than to prove, in heart and deed, the extent to which they can do good. Doing good is the heart and soul, the core and kernel, and the most pronounced message of the Quran and therefore of Islam and Islamic governance. If there is hell and heaven, punishment and reward, and if God is the one, the punisher, the compassionate, and the merciful, it is all deployed for one purpose and one purpose only: to create the good doer and hence the good community, for there would be no meaning for His oneness, mercy, and wrath without this concept of good. But the call to goodness is not an ambiguous invocation, a moral injunction devoid of content. To be good is both a defined and defining concept that can be located within the 5 pillars of religion, pillars that Islam, from the beginning until this very present, never questioned and, more importantly, never abandoned. If the pillars are by definition exclusivist, and they are, it is because everything other than them is subsidiary and subordinate. If these are the pillars, then everything else is not. But since the Sharia and Islamic governance must, by necessity, regulate all human behavior, then that which is not a pillar must conform to the pillar's dictates and aggregate will. Which is to say that the structure and operation of the pillared system predetermines both the subject and subjectivity, preparing them to embark upon that which lies in the non-pillared world. And the pillars, accurately reflecting the tenor of the Quranic philosophy, are anchored in a simple message. Understand your place in the world. Understand your own transience. Understand that you are created as part of a community and of a family that together feed your soul, just as plants and grains feed your body. Understand that all this is a gift that comes with a responsibility toward everything around you. Understand that you really own nothing, that you will inevitably face your end and that you will take nothing with you to the grave except your good deeds, your good name. Understand that you have duties toward the world in which you have been created, toward the community that was created for you and that is your anchor. Take nothing for granted. It is this foundational understanding that underlies a set of performative acts and utterances which have a cumulative shaping effect on the body, soul, and mind. In their entirety, these acts are private, internal, and thus effective. From prayer and fasting, which both locate themselves in that foundational understanding. To pilgrimage and almsgiving. The total effect of these acts tends to shape the Muslim subject, fulfilling the desideratum of the Sharia, of Islamic governance, and therefore of the art of living itself. The remaining Shari laws and rules presuppose such a subject and operate, in one strong sense, as the addendum and annotation of this morally formed subject. By stark contrast, the subject of the modern state is not wholly formed by the moral imperative. The conventional morality of tradition is constantly contested by a state-oriented technology of the self that systemically and systematically operates to create the national citizen. The contest is summed up with pinpoint precision in the statement that it is not the duty of the state to make us good. That is our business. The duty of the state, fulfilled maximally and most faithfully through education and nationalistic discourse, among much else, is to create the efficient and productive citizen, the subject of law and order who is willing to die for his country and nation. Whereas Islam, as we have seen, does not command sacrifice of life, even for the sake of God, the modern nation-state is inconceivable without this requirement. But there is another difference still. Whereas the aggregate effects of Islamic governance are intended to fashion the moral subject who interacts responsibly with an anima mundi and with community and family, the subject of the modern state is an exteriorized personality whose soul and spirit are of no concern but whose value resides in a political, materialistic, and efficiency-based conception of life. Put differently, whereas the Muslim subject strives for moral improvement, the state subject strives to fulfill sovereign will, fictitiously a representation of the subject's own will but realistically the will of a commanding sovereign. The difference is a paradigmatic one between a continuous and unending moral struggle for the ought and a continuous and unending worldly struggle for the is, which aims to maintain a hold over the material bounties of an otherwise brute world of fact. The subject of is and the subject of ought are two drastically different human subjects. They stand not only in diametrical opposition but in irreconcilable contradiction. Fifth and finally, the modern state, in its collaboration and contestation with the globalization project, remains engaged in a preeminently material world of fact. It depends on and promotes a homo economicus whose exclusive and ultimate desideratum is material profit and little else. This stands in sharp contrast with the morally constructed homo economicus of Islam and its governance, a species that is subordinated to a higher moral imperative. This latter subject is neither contingent nor a mere accident in the structure and makeup of Islam and Islamic governance. It is of its essence. Without this moral homo economicus there could hardly be an Islam, Muslims, or a Muslim civilization, at least in the way we have come to know them. It is precisely this homo economicus that created, over the course of an entire millennium, a civil society that kept politics and executive power at bay and that defined what Islam was. The paradigmatic Muslim homo economicus seeks wealth and profit but remains materially and psychologically committed to social responsibility. As is abundantly evidenced in 12 centuries of Islamic socio-economic history. Honor, prestige, nearness to God, and the love and respect of family and neighbor all paradigmatically intersect with this ethic of indebtedness to one's own community. As everything is owned by the ultimate sovereign, wealth and profit are not possessed by or destined for only the rich. They are made from and for the sake of the ultimate sovereign, whose rights are identical with those of the rights of the poor and unprivileged. In this equation, the poor are integral to God, and He is integral to them. Serve them, and you serve God. Serve God, and you serve them. Produced by the state and pushed, though willingly, into a brute world of economic competition and profit. The modern subject is one who will find the true Muslim homo economicus a curiosity and an aberration, something belonging to the museum of extinct species. Raised on the moral technologies of the self and imbued with a mild form of asceticism. The Muslim homo economicus would similarly regard his modernist counterpart as irrational, greedy, short-sighted, and selfish. In short, a brute. The oppositions between the two and their utter incompatibility are nothing short of staggering. The totality of these inherent and fundamental oppositions poses a significant problem. If Muslims are to organize their lives in social, economic, and political terms, then they face a crucial choice. Either they must succumb to the modern state and the world that produced it, or the modern state and the world that produced it must recognize the legitimacy of Islamic governance. That is, the Muslim conception of polity, law, and, most importantly, morality and its subordinated political and economic demands. The first option would at first glance seem more realistic, given that at present it is largely accepted by Muslims and even their intellectuals, though often on the erroneous assumption that the system of the modern state can in good time be converted to an Islamic state. As I have argued in the previous chapters, this assumption foregoes a proper understanding of the nature of the modern state, its form properties, and its inherent moral incompatibility with any form of Islamic governance. The second option seems, to all indications, far less likely, since any form of Islamic governance will have to live within a system of states that itself is under pressure from the imperatives of a globalized world. If the modern state, as so many analysts tell us, must itself compete with and readjust under the pressure of globalization, an Islamic governance would suffer multiple and incremental challenges that will quite likely cause its decline and, as likely, total collapse. 2. A way out? Yet there is something worthy of investigation beyond this realpolitik, which by definition rests on a skewed vision of morality. Just as the modern state sits uncomfortably in the Muslim and much of the Afro-Asian world, modernity as a whole sits rather problematically in the entirety of this world of ours, including the very Euro-America that originally produced it. Throughout this book, we have alluded to some of these problems, which range from the spiritual vacuousness of the fragmented, hedonistic, and narcissistic self to the destruction of the organic community, family, and natural environment, none of which can be dissociated from the overarching project of the modern state. Thus the interrogations of the modern project cannot do without placing the state at the forefront of critique. Nor can they do without at the same time placing the destruction of the environment and the natural world at the center of our gaze. Because, as I have already argued, our attitude to and dealings with this natural world is the measure of our existence, of our estimation of what it means for us to be human beings. The consequence of these attitudes is not, as many think, just a fact of life, a merely unfortunate byproduct of our otherwise good intentions and soundly established acts of progress. Rather, it is the ultimate measure of man because it constitutes the lowest benchmark against which our moral accountability toward all things in the world must be gauged and judged. It is, in other words, the most central question plaguing what ought to be the central domain of the moral. A question whose solution predetermines all other questions, problems, and, in turn, their solutions within the entirety of what we have called subsidiary domains. I shall take it for granted here that while these problems constitute significant physical and practical challenges that must be met in empirical and concrete ways, they are, as Durkheim argued in a similar context, essentially moral problems, because they ultimately stem from a distortion in our moral vision of nature and because only through implementing a correction to this vision can these problems be solved in satisfactory and genuine ways. And these solutions have direct bearings not only on any possibility of Islamic governance in the modern world but also and primarily on the modern state and the modern condition in which it exists. As we shall stress in these concluding pages, the most fundamental problems of modern Islam are not exclusively Islamic but are in fact equally integral to the modern project itself in the East and the West. In addressing the issues involved here, we must return to the Enlightenment distinction between the is and ought, a distinction whose ramifications have profoundly shaped modernity's prevalent conceptions of the moral. As a way of proceeding, we shall invoke the critiques of H. A. Pritchard and Charles Larmor, whose work, combined with those of Taylor and McIntyre, captures the main issues that concern us here. As we noted earlier, the distinction between is and ought stood in a dialectical causal relationship with the separation of value from a natural world that came to be regarded as brute and inert. When matter is stripped of all value, it ceases to be part of an anima mundi and thus can be treated as an object. It can be studied and subjected to the entire range of our autonomous rational analysis, and thus to our actions, without it making moral demands on us. But this unprecedented paradigmatic distinction created another significant effect. Namely, the isolation of reason from reasons, reason being a tool of thinking about the world and reasons representing the substantive causes that generate thought through reason. Whereas before the Enlightenment reason and reasons worked indistinctly together. After the Enlightenment reason, as distinct from reasons, was elevated to an autonomous status and was expected to generate reasons on its own. Hence modern moral philosophy's unwavering insistence that morality must be justified by autonomous and self-legislative reason. The backbone of the Kantian conception that rules over the modern moral paradigm. Although this Kantian position has been subjected to repeated and damaging critiques, it still persisted and has not ceased to prove attractive. The reason being the entrenchment in all modern thinking of the distinction between fact and value, where the world is seen as ultimately nothing more than the matter in motion, normatively mute, and barren of any guidance as to how we are to conduct ourselves. Here, reason has reduced reasons to a nullity, and, as Spengler argued, denied all possibilities outside itself. As Pritchard and Larmor, and more generally with them Taylor and McIntyre, among others, have in effect argued, it is impossible to reason our way to morality via autonomous rationality, which rests, as we have seen, on the Kantian notion of freedom. Pritchard has argued that this essentially Kantian approach is doomed to failure because it rests on the mistake of supposing the possibility of proving what can only be apprehended directly by an act of moral thinking. But the appeal of autonomous rationality as grounded in freedom is in no way a fortuitous one, for the essence of this brand of rationality is precisely the will to freedom. This freedom, in the final analysis, is not merely our personal and private freedom, which of course it is, but the freedom of man to rule over nature and all that is found in it, including anything human that may come to be defined as integral to it. For example, the noble savage, those beings who live in a state of nature. It is the freedom from the obligations of living under the moral demands of this world as a cosmic system of value that imposes, as such, its own constraints on us. The ethics of autonomy, which derives from this freedom, has been so dominant that one philosopher went so far as to declare it the only one consistent with the metaphysics of the modern world. But as Larmor and Pritchard have convincingly argued, this conception of self-legislative reason makes little sense because it assumes reason or the Kantian rational will to be an agent and a proactive legislator. When reason, in fact, is not an agent but rather a faculty that we, who are the agents, exercise more or less well. This faculty is, so to speak, a machine of reasoning that deliberates over what we see as reasons and that, having undertaken this deliberation, adduces the reasons for believing or acting in a certain way. Reason, in other words, cannot be autonomous, because in order for its dormant potential to be realized, it must be activated, and this can happen only by responding to reasons. Hence reason entails receptivity to reasons, and therefore no principle can count as rational unless there exist reasons that recommend its acceptance. Thus, for there to be such things as reasons for thought and action, reason must introduce them to the world from without, by way of imposing principles of its own devising on the neutral face of nature, that is, assuming that the face of nature is neutral. It is precisely here that this account seems to exhibit a naturalistic conception of the world. Having successfully dislodged the Hobbesian and Kantian arguments and having forcefully and just as successfully elaborated the distinction between reason and reasons, Larmor could conclude that the only way to acknowledge the authority of morality is to focus, at the outset and without any detour through my own good, on the Defining value of moral thinking. Namely, the fact that another's good is in itself a reason for action on my part. Our moral identity consists not in valuing our own humanity and thereby determining that we ought to value humanity in whatever person it may happen to appear. It is a reason to love our neighbor in no less an immediate fashion than we are naturally moved to care about ourselves. The Kantian ethics of autonomy needs to be jettisoned, and in its stead belongs what I have called the autonomy of morality. By which I mean that morality forms an autonomous, irreducible domain of value, into which we cannot reason ourselves from without, but which we must simply acknowledge. Just what quality of the world might constitute the context of reasons for this autonomy is a question that Larmor answers in general Platonic terms. Reasons constitute an intrinsically normative order of reality, irreducible to physical or psychological fact. But where do we go from here so that we can attach specifically defined substance and a particular meaning to reasons? What is it in a world saturated with value that tells us, in concrete, precise terms, what another's good consists of? And how do we define this good in a specific cultural context and in each concrete instance? Ironically, such 20th and 21st century questions and debates, emerging out of formidable modern science and rational thought, intimately echo the very debates in which Muslims engaged more than 1,000 years ago. The questions and problems they encountered, substantively the same raised by the Kantians, Neo-Kantians, Anti-Kantians, and others, were intellectual battlefields for over 2 centuries. From the middle of the 8th century A.D. to the end of the 10th and beyond, major legal intellectual movements emerged representing the entire spectrum of intellectual difference on the issue of morality, its autonomy, and the role of reason in determining human actions. The only major difference between the two debates is their contexts. While the greatest number of Enlightenment thinkers, for all their diversity, knew only a disenchanted world, the pre-modern Muslim intellectuals inhabited a world that was, more or less, enchanted. These intellectuals, locking their intellectual horns for over 2 centuries, finally settled on what I have elsewhere called the Great Synthesis, namely, the synthesis between reason and reasons. There could be no more a denial of a world saturated with value than of a world in which the human rational faculty, God's own creation, is both ever-present and forceful. And the Sharia, the defining belief and practice of Muslims, was the result of a synthesis between the two. In fact, from its beginning, Islam has defined itself as alam al-waza, the middle community, a concept sanctioned by the Quran itself and later elaborated upon in legal, theological, and epistemic ways. The middle community, defined in the Sharia by the elaborate and complex discursive field of al-fiqh, legal theory, became conceived as such precisely because it occupied a middle position between the Muslim Kantians, so to speak, and the literalists, those who wished to reduce human reason to a marginal status. If it metaphorically became known as the middle community, it was because these two extreme camps were relegated to minorities. The majority adopting a middle ground, where reason must be the discoverer of reasons, the latter making their moral demands and constraining the former. But whence do reasons emerge? In chapters 4 and 5, we have detailed an answer at some length, having characterized the source of reasons as a cosmic moral order. It is precisely the paradigmatic attributes of this order that was the business of the Quran. While fulfilling contracts, distributing shares of inheritance, and punishing the offender constituted a part, however minuscule, of the Quranic corpus, any insightful reader of the text cannot fail to realize that these substantive judgments were incidental byproducts of the overarching Quranic message. That we humans do not own the earth. That there is something or someone bigger than us. That being created in communities concomitantly creates the obligation on our part to perform good works. That humanity and morality are concomitant. That divine omnipotence, however eternal and abstract, is functionally and sociologically laid in the service of these grand moral imperatives. there is no meaning for this omnipotence without the moral imperative, for the very raison d'etre of this omnipotence hinges on the demand for, and insistence upon, the moral domain. Should the moral domain one day disappear from this cosmic order, then omnipotence would have no reason to continue to exist. The world was already created by this omnipotence, a faculty that can now be withdrawn or set aside, since the task has been accomplished. But if omnipotence remains, it is by virtue of its twin, omnipresence, this latter guaranteeing the continuity of the former as keeper of the moral domain. The Quran, the Sharia, and the jurists who represented it for centuries all recognized the permanency of this moral domain. Yet all of them also recognized, and with equal force, the fact that the particular legal norms to be derived from this moral domain are situational, subject to the never-ending ijtihad. This latter captures the soul and body of the coextensiveness of reason and reasons, of the constant dialectic between them that allows for the eternal moral domain to manifest itself variably according to time, need, and circumstance. If the Quran was revealed in the idiom of the Arabs, it was, as it repeatedly states, for the purpose of making the moral domain comprehensible to them through their language and customs. The Sharia followed this logic most faithfully, adopting the telling maxim, which it consistently and persistently practiced throughout the centuries, that the Sharia is good for all times and places. And what made this possible was the concept and institution of ijtihad. The constantly renewed effort to reason the moral law, to examine at every turn and in every instance the dialectic between reason and reasons. In this tradition, reason was through and through unfailingly receptive to reasons. 3. Courses of action. As we saw, Sharia's moral bent was like a thorn in the side of colonialism in the Muslim world, a thorn that had to be extracted. Sharia's decimation in the 19th century thus sums it all up. Modernity and its state could not and cannot accept the Sharia on its own terms because these terms are profoundly moral and egalitarian. Whereas the state and the world that produced it relegated the moral to a subsidiary domain. To state the case minimally, colonialism's central domain was the economic and the political, not the moral. And so the economic cum political remains as the central domain of modernity and its increasing globalization. Yet despite the destructive effects of colonialism, historical Sharia today remains, ever more forcefully, the locus of the central domain of the moral. While its institutions, hermeneutics, and personnel have all vanished without hope of return, its moral effects persist with unwavering stubbornness. This moral system, a capital of immeasurable value, can sustain at least two courses of action, one internal, the other external. First, in line with the central domain of the moral and its imperatives, Muslims can now begin, especially in light of the Arab Spring, to articulate and construct nascent forms of governance that would be in due course amenable to further and more robust development along the same lines. This would require nonconformist thinking and native imagination. Because the social units that would make up the larger socio-political order must be rethought in terms of moral communities that need, among other things, to be re-enchanted. Historical moral resources would provide a blueprint for a definition of what it means to engage with economics, education, private and public spheres and, most of all, the environment and the natural order. It would also provide for a concept of communal and individual rights, which would require a clear understanding of the shortcomings and strengths of the liberal order's concept of rights. An articulate position on rights is of the essence, as we will see momentarily. But internal, indigenous considerations of the community as the central domain of the moral would be the ultimate basis on which an evincive theory of anti-universalism might be constructed. A theory that advocates the uniqueness of world societies but that also must summon up the intellectual stamina needed to provide a persuasive antidote to the dominating liberal concept of universalism. This initial but sustained process is therefore dialectical, moving back and forth between the constructive efforts of community building and a discursive negotiation with, and of, the modern state and its liberal values, in both East and West. As we will see, insisting on the second component of this dialectic is as essential as the steadfastness with which the first component, the raison d'etre of the entire project, is pursued. Such a steady and slowly evolving approach has the promise, if not the assurance, of initial success, avoiding, if not evading, thanks to its low-key programmatic, the forces we have identified in this book as antagonistic to and destructive of full-scale Islamic governance. Second, during the long process of building nascent institutions, which would require a restatement of Sharia rules and a reconceptualization of political community, Muslims and their intellectual and political elites can and must engage their Western counterparts with respect to the necessity of positioning the moral as the central domain, which would in turn require Muslims to develop a vocabulary that these interlocutors can understand. A vocabulary that, among other things, attends to the concept of rights within the context of the necessity to construct variants of the moral order befitting each society. Here, Muslims engaged in this process would be convinced and would expend the utmost intellectual energy in persuading others, including Muslim liberals, that universalism and a universalist theory of rights can have no fate but ultimate failure. In other words, even during this initial process of building morally based communities, there is much that Muslims can do to contribute to the reformation of modern moralities. Such a proposition may at first glance seem bold and far-fetched. But it is not. For there is at least one important moral strand of Western philosophical and political thought that exhibits a near identity with the current Islamic quest, providing intellectual energy to the postmodern critique, however problematically modern this critique remains. As we have seen, the moral quest of modern Islam, which reflects the continuing commitment of today's Muslims to the central domain of the moral, finds its equivalent in the slim yet resounding voices of the McIntyres, Taylors, and even liberal Larmores of the Western world. But this resemblance, nay commonality, is neither coincidental nor fortuitous, because all these voices, Muslim and Christian, Eastern and Western, are responding to the same moral condition, however much their respective vocabularies and idioms may differ from each other. The paramount questions therefore remain. Can these forces, on all sides, transcend their ethnocentricity and join ranks in the interrogation of the modern project and its state? Can the Taylors summon enough intellectual courage to become McIntyres? Can they all, Western and non-Western, dismantle the pernicious myth of a clash of civilizations? Can they augment their moral power so as to bring about a victory that installs the moral as the central domain of world cultures, irrespective of civilizational variants? For, just as there can be no Islamic governance without such a victory, there will be no victory in the first place without modernity experiencing a moral awakening. This has yet to happen. The political forms which may arise in truly post-Enlightenment cultures will be those that shelter and express diversity, that enable different cultures, some but by no means all or even most of which are dominated by liberal forms of life, different worldviews and ways of life, to coexist in peace and harmony. For this to be a real historical possibility, however, certain conceptions and commitments that have been constitutive, not merely of the Enlightenment and so of modernity, but also, and more fundamentally, of the central traditions of Western civilization, must be amended, or abandoned. Certain conceptions, not only of morality but also of science, that are central elements in Enlightenment cultures must be given up. Certain understandings of religion, long established in Western traditions, not as a vessel for a particular way of life but rather as the bearer of truths possessing universal authority, must be relinquished. The most fundamental Western commitment, the humanist conception of humankind as a privileged site of truth, which is expressed in Socratic inquiry and in Christian revelation, and which re-emerges in secular and naturalistic form in the Enlightenment project of human self-emancipation through the growth of knowledge, must be given up. It is in reaching a new relationship with our natural environment, with the earth and the other living things with which we share the earth, in which human subjectivity is not taken to be the measure of all things. That a turn in our inherited traditions of thought can be accomplished, which opens up the possibility of profoundly different forms of human community dwelling together on earth in peace. Dwelling together on earth in peace is certainly a tall order. Perhaps another modern utopia. But subjecting modernity to a restructuring moral critique is the most essential requirement not only for the rise of Islamic governance but also for our material and spiritual survival. Islamic governance and Muslims have no monopoly over crisis.